Hi everyone, Molton here. Welcome back to another game. So today we're getting a double black. So again, we're going to go for the modern defense, bishop to g7. And our opponent's gone for c4, so we're just going to transpose back into a King's Indian. If you want to avoid the King's Indian, you can also play other systems here, such as e5 or the knight d7 then e5, which is actually what we call the modern tiger variation, I believe. But I'm just going to go back into a King's Indian defense here with the move knight to f6. Bishop to d3, we're just going to castle the king to safety. Knight to e2. Now typically a good system against bishop to d3, whenever you see the bishop coming out to d3, is to play the knight to c6. This is often the one I choose. And it's just a little bit easier for you to follow through with the move pawn to e5 next. But you can opt for other ones as well if you don't like it. Now after the move pawn to f3, we want to provoke white to push some of his pawns. He's actually playing some sort of samish system. Whenever you put the pawn on f3, we call this the samish variation, but he's put his bishop on d3. Typically the bishop stays on f1. So I think maybe his idea is to shuffle this bishop across to c2. In any case, we can follow through with e5 here, or we can wait and maybe play knight d7 then e5. I'm going to play the move knight to d7 just to see what he does. Maybe we can provoke him to push the pawns and weaken his pawn structure a little bit. So instead he goes for bishop to e3. So I'm just going to hit out in the center with the move pawn to e5. This is a very normal pawn push. You should either be aiming to play e5 or c5. Now after the move pawn to d5, we have three options for our knight. So we can go knight to e7, we can go knight to b4, or we can go knight to d4. Now knight to b4 may look tempting at first because it attacks the bishop, and to avoid the bishop being captured, he probably has to move it to a square such as b1. But the problem with these type of moves is that after bishop to b1, your knight's just going to get chased back, and then you don't really have a good square after that. It's going to be stuck on a6, and he can always bring the bishop back into the game. Knight e7 would be the most natural move, and after the move knight to e7, we can follow through with the move pawn to f5, so that would be totally okay. There's also the move knight to d4. So after the move knight to d4, he can't capture with the knight. He can capture with the bishop, but as you'll see, if he captures with the bishop, he'll have to give up this really important dark squared bishop, and even if we lose a pawn for it, it doesn't really matter, so it should be fine for us. So I go for this knight to d4 move. Now he's gone for the move rook to c1. Now we want to cement this knight on this square. Since he can't capture this knight at the moment, I'm going to put more protection on this knight by pushing my pawn to c5. So this is a good idea whenever you have a very strong piece on a very centralized outpost. You can further support it with your pawns. And what I'm doing here is that I'm actually going to cement my knight on this square, and if he ever captures the knight, it's going to give me a healthy passed pawn. So here I'm not going to take the knight on e2, because that would just open up the d file, and that would essentially give him free pressure on the d file. So instead of allowing that to happen, I'm going to push my pawn to c5. I do weaken this d5 square. So every time you you go for a square, you always leave a square behind. Just make sure that when you push your pawns, there's always a square left behind. So just be aware of that and any weaknesses you may be creating. But in this position, it's totally fine and it's totally worth it. So he does get his knight to this square, but I can always chase the knight away with, let's say, knight to b6. Should be fine. And as you can see, this knight is a real thorn in white's position, because if he ever captures it, then he leaves me with a strong supported pass pawn. But the opposite is not true for him, because if I capture the knight on d5, he recaptures, then I actually have this pawn on d6, which is preventing white from pushing his pawn further. So definitely my position is a little bit, say, have better prospects here. So in these situations, what black usually, or what white usually does, is actually just play around the knight. Maybe play knight to c3, b3 first perhaps, to defend the c4 pawn, and then bring the knight to c3, maybe play queen d2. It's something you should learn to do when your opponent has a very strong piece. Sometimes it's not always good to capture it, because it sort of releases the pressure a little bit, and also perhaps improves their pawn structure. But if you can sort of play around the piece for a while, then you can capture it later at a favorable stage in the game. So he's going for the move pawn to b3 as we expected. Now I can immediately capture this knight, forcing him to put a pawn on d5. This is probably the best option, because I don't want his knight to end up on c3 and recapturing here on c3 with the knight. I would rather him recapture with the pawn. This way he no longer has this square on d5 for his pieces to use. So now that he's stuck with a pawn on the d5 square, I can start to put some pressure with some typical King's Indian moves, such as f5. I also have ideas of maybe going a5, a4 later on, and there's also perhaps bishop to a6 and queen to a5 as well. But I'm going to start out with the move pawn to f5 here. Okay, so after this move, so bishop a6 is met by, it looks like it's going to be met by bishop to d3. I can also take the pawn. If I take the pawn, pawn takes. I have bishop to g4. The bishop will go to d3. But it looks like everything is well and truly defended, I think. But maybe I take bishop to g4, put pressure on this pin, and then maybe at some point swing my queen here. Oh, actually, I see there's also another option of pawn takes, rook takes. And if he goes queen takes, I can perhaps play bishop to a6 there, because then the knight's pinned and he doesn't have to move bishop to d3. So that also looks like a good option. And at any time, if he ever takes on d4, it should be good for me. So I'm going to take here just to give him a weakness on e4. So now he has a permanent weakness on e4. Now, if we start with rook takes rook, if he goes king takes, it looks like he's walking into a bunch of pins there. I don't see an immediate win. If bishop to a6, he always has bishop to d3. So with the king on, if king takes f1, maybe we have to go bishop to g4. And after bishop to d3, maybe I can bring my queen out to h4. So what we want to do is, if we can get some situation where leave him with this light squared bishop, that would be ideal, because this is probably his worst piece in this particular structure, because all his pawns are on white squares, whereas the dark squared bishop is his best piece. So I'm going to trade off here, because he can't take back with the queen, I don't think, because that runs into bishop a6. Well, I'm pretty sure he shouldn't take back with the queen. So I go bishop a6. Now he has to give up his bishop, which is a very important piece, but it also frees up this square on e5. So when I recapture, this bishop can go to e5, and then my queen can come out to, say, g5 or h4, and my rook can come into play as well. So also, I've noticed people are moving really quickly in 1510. I think they move quicker in 1510 than they do in, say, 5-minute games or blitz. It's odd, really. Because you feel like you want to be taking your time in 15-minute games, but people really like to rush the moves. Okay, what moves do I have here? I have queen to g5, I have bishop to e5, then queen to g5 or queen h4. The rook's probably going to come to f1, but there's no real checks here apart from f7. The bishop covers all the dark squares, so I don't really have to worry about anything happening there. I could play this move queen to g5, but then this is idea to play knight here perhaps. Queen g5, knight here. I can always play rook to f8 and bishop to e5 to put pressure on that knight. So I don't see anything wrong with it. So let's go queen g5. It develops a piece with a tempo, attacks the rook. We're also threatening to take the knight and capture this rook. Also bring this rook to f8. Yes, a bishop to d3. This makes a lot of sense. So we should use the tempo with the move rook to f8 here just to chase the queen away. So yeah, the queen moves away. Can we play the move bishop to c8 now? I don't really want to trade these bishops because, like I said, this is probably the worst piece in the position. Do we have any back rank mating threats as well? Something like queen f6 and then go for queen f2 check. Actually, maybe we do. If we play the move queen to f6 here, what does he play? Well, actually, are we even threatening mate? It takes the bishop. Check here, queen check. So we give up our queen, but the knight can actually retreat to g1, so it doesn't quite work. Is there anything else? Bishop c8. I'm just going to go bishop c8. I don't really want to trade off bishops here, because as I mentioned, this light squared bishop is white's worst piece in this position. And I want to stay as active as I possibly can though, so I don't want to drop my pieces back too much if I can help it. Can I stay active here by playing the move queen to d2 or queen to h6? So I would much rather play either queen h6 or queen to d2. I don't really want to drop my queen back all the way to e7, because then it's going to be difficult to bring the queen back into the game, perhaps. Although I do have bishop to e5 coming. So if queen h6, he can't take this pawn because queen check on e3 would pick up the bishop. And also queen h6 threatens bishop e5, and it also attacks this pawn on h2 at the same time. So I will play queen to h6. It also prevents the knight from coming into this f4 square. And it keeps an eye on this rook as well. So it does quite a lot of useful things. And it's very, very difficult for him to stop bishop to e5 next move. He probably has to go h3 at some point, but yeah, black is gaining the initiative here. After bishop to e5, the queen will hop into e3 if the white queen ever moves from the g3 square. And you see the importance of this e5 square. So in a lot of positions, e5 square is extremely important in many different openings, like the King's Indian, especially Benoni, Sicilians. It's very important square, usually for the knight, but in this case, the bishop is very, very powerful there. So it goes h3, so we go bishop to e5 in this position, cementing this bishop on this e5 square, and then chasing the queen away. Now there's no way for him to stop the move queen to e3 check, which is coming next. Not to mention the ideas of sacrificing the bishop and so on, but the easiest move here is just to check with the queen and capture this bishop on d3. Okay, so we get into a King's Indian position. So there's actually a nice nice trap in this variation. I think it goes after the move queen to f3, knight to c6, knight to e2. I've had this in a game before where I played the move knight to d7. In this position, my opponent played the move bishop to e3. Now, if you want to try and work out the win for black, you can quickly pause the video and try to work it out. And for those of you who spotted the move knight to e5, well done, because this just wins on the spot. It wins everything. Pawn takes, we sacrifice the knight temporarily, but then we win it back, and not just that, we capture everything else. We win the pawn on b2 and basically take everything. So after the move knight to e2, we can't do this because there's no queen on f3, but we can use the same sort of plan. So we can go knight to d7, e5, and then yeah, so I was saying knight to e7 is perfectly fine in this position to go pawn to f5, but I think it's probably better to go knight to d4. If ever white tries to go for something like this, you might end up losing the pawn on d4 even, but it doesn't really matter, because even if you lose the pawn, you've gained such a powerful bishop in return, and this dark squared bishop especially is extremely strong on this diagonal, so I don't think you should worry too much about losing this pawn on d4. You will gain compensation for it, trust me. So just like for example here, I can, let's just say knight c5, knight takes, let's say you follow through with f5 to attack the pawns in the center, and this is using some tactics, by the way. For example, if white captures here, you could capture the knight and follow through with the move queen to h4 check, hitting the king and winning the piece back on d4. And of course, if white doesn't do anything about it, then you would just take here on e4 and have a very, very pleasant position. At the very, very least, you probably have even better moves than taking on e4. Maybe f4 is also worth considering as well. But yeah, this is very, very good. After rook c1, it allows us to play c5, and this cements our knight into this square. If white allowed us, we would have put the knight on c5 here, and maybe brought it back to e6 even. But here we cement the knight with the move pawn to c5, and we see the difference is that our knight, if ever captured, we get a passed pawn. White's knight, though, doesn't provide the same utility. And here, yeah, after move f5, we have very pleasant position. It's very tempting here to go f4 as well, which is probably also fine, and then follow through with h5, g4 type of plan. But I opted for just taking on e4 because it looked like there was some tactics involving bishop g4, bishop a6 here. And after pawn takes, we capture, and then here I thought king takes was necessary, but then after king takes, maybe bishop to g4, bishop to d3, and queen h4 here looks very, very good, with ideas such as trading off these dark squared bishops and bringing the rook into the game. So just remember, this light square bishop is white's worst piece in this position, whereas the dark square bishop is actually quite a good piece for white. So trading that off is quite favorable for you. So bishop a6. This position, again, I don't want to trade off these bishops. I want to keep these bishops on the board. Well, I don't want to trade off his bishop. And then queen h6, bishop e5, then we just get a very strong initiative from there. So I hope you guys enjoyed this game in the King's Indian. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Take care.